The election of 1932 served as the turning point for the era of the Great Depression. Franklin D. Roosevelt won in a landslide 4 elections in a row. He gave hope to the American people that he could save the economy from collapse.
It was pretty clear from the outset that Hoover was going to be facing a really uphill fight. Hoover was first elected in 1928, took office in 1929, and 6 months later the economy really started to tank. And although if you look at the period, it had its ups and downs, generally speaking it was a downward progression from 1929 to 1932. Oddly enough, in the summer and fall of 1932, the economy started to pick up a little bit, and that gave Hoover some hope. But Hoover had to contend not only with very high unemployment, but the fact that he was dull. I mean, if you tried listening to him on, you could find sound clips of him on the internet, and it's a wonder that anyone was able to stay awake during his speeches, which were really long, and he was kind of monotone. FDR, on the other hand, in addition to being an outsider, he was a captivating speaker on the radio. And by 1932, radio was something that most Americans had, and it was the way that more and more people were getting their news. So in an election where radio mattered, he had a clear advantage. FDR, although he was kind of cagey about what he would do as president, he understood from the beginning that he was the odds-on favorite to win, and figured that the more specific he got on policy, all that could do is alienate people. So he was pretty general, but one thing that he hammered again and again, he hammered on Hoover and said that this was the fault of the Republicans, and that by bringing in a Democrat, that was going to fix things. Aside from how that was going to work, he was pretty vague. And Hoover was a touchy guy to begin with. He was an odd duck for politics, really, because the guy was an engineer. He had never held an elected office before becoming president of the United States. But he was a very talented engineer. He was a self-made millionaire. He grew up dirt poor, an orphan, but was a self-made millionaire as a mining engineer. And he developed this global reputation as a problem solver, a guy who didn't have he wasn't ideological. He just would do whatever worked. And he had gone from one success to another. In the 1920s, he was wildly popular. He had served as Secretary of Commerce under Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge, and he was the dominant figure in those, aside from the president himself, in those presidencies. So when Coolidge announced that he wasn't going to run for re-election in 1928, everybody started to look to Hoover as the alternative. But because he wasn't naturally a political guy, he wasn't really good at day-to-day politics, and he was really thin-skinned about stuff. You could insult FDR, and it's not that he's going to like it, but he understands that he's a politician, and you just let that stuff roll off your back. Hoover nursed really deep and lasting grudges, and he became increasingly peevish as the campaign went on, and that's something the American people never like. So it was no surprise to anyone when Hoover was decisively beaten in the 1932 election. Hoover was really, he stood on his record. He said, I'm not ideological. I'm the guy who solves problems. What's often forgotten today is Hoover really did expand the size and the scope of government, much more so than any other president before him in peacetime. Nevertheless, he has this reputation today as this ideological, laissez-faire guy who refused to have government do things. It's simply not true. Now, there were certain things where he said, no, wait a minute, if the federal government starts doing that, it's going to mess things up. For instance, he didn't like the federal government giving direct relief to individuals. He said if you do that, that messes up the relationship between the citizens and their government. If the citizens become dependent on their government, then we can't really maintain our Republican form of government. That was his argument. FDR, it seems, agreed with that to a certain extent. However, he was not going to run on that. FDR was being very cagey about what specifically he would do. In fact, he complained that Hoover was spending too much money, though it turned out in practice FDR would spend a lot more money than Hoover did. The two things well, I'll say three things that FDR emphasized. The Depression is the fault of the Republicans, not merely Hoover. Hoover just happened to be the guy unfortunate enough to be in the White House when it hit. But the fact is the Republicans controlled both houses of Congress and the presidency pretty much throughout the 1920s. So he said this crisis is their fault. The second thing he said consistently was the tariffs are too high and that we need more free trade, and that's going to help the economy. How it would do that, he was never all that clear on. And third, prohibition is bad. We need to eliminate prohibition. By 1932, that was a pretty popular sentiment.
After Roosevelt's landslide win in 1932, he became one of the longest-serving presidents in U.S. history, with 3 full terms and part of a 4th. Because of this, it was easy for him to make the decisions and changes he envisioned for America.
FDR, for probably the certainly through his first term, FDR got everything he wanted. And he had a very ambitious agenda. So in terms of getting the things that he proposed, he has to be counted as one of the most successful presidents in U.S. history.
It was filled with great uncertainty from the American people in terms of the economic and political future of the country following the stock market crash and the institution of the start of the Great Depression. Mass uncertainty about what the future holds. The American people are very pessimistic about their own individual futures and the futures of their children. FDR, to his credit, restores the sense of confidence, not only in American institutions, but in Americans ourselves. He defeats Hoover in the election of 1832, and he'll go on to win 3 more presidential elections.
Alf Landon was the next Republican nominee to run against Roosevelt. However, he could not convince the American people that he would be a better presidential candidate than FDR.
Landon was an odd choice. He was pretty progressive, pretty liberal for a Republican. He was a popular governor of Kansas, but he really didn't like leaving Kansas. So he didn't campaign particularly effectively. He wasn't a great stump speaker. He never really, his whole campaign was sort of, well, I will do a lot of the same things that FDR has been doing, except I will do them for less money and I'll do it more efficiently. And that's not a terribly inspiring message.
Although Roosevelt had a comfortable victory in 1940, Wendell Willkie proved to be a better competitor than Landon.
Willkie was a much better candidate than Landon. The guy was handsome and charming, and he was a dynamic campaigner. But he was also hesitant to, I mean, he didn't really draw sharp distinctions with FDR on domestic policy. Said, I'll do a lot of the same things, because in fact, here's what several people pointed out. Up until, I think, 1938, Willkie had been a Democrat. He switched parties in the late 1930s, and so even a lot of Republicans said, is this the guy we really want leading us? He said, I'll do many of the same things that FDR's been doing, but I'll spend less money and I'll do it more efficiently. Increasingly, where he did draw a distinction with FDR, it was on foreign policy, which is odd because, in fact, Willkie and FDR really agreed on a lot when it came to foreign policy. But Willkie decided that the best way to gain leverage was to attack him on that. So Willkie claimed that FDR was angling to get the United States involved in the war in Europe, which had broken out in 1939. And that worked. Polls showed that as he played to that, his poll numbers, because he started off with a really bad disadvantage in the polls, but as he played to that theme, his poll numbers started going up, but not enough. In the end, he lost, and he lost handily, but it wasn't nearly as much of a landslide as 1936.
Although rumors of Roosevelt's failing health spread throughout the country, there was little doubt that he would run for a fourth term. Roosevelt's opposition, Thomas Dewey, stood little chance because of the U.S. involvement in World War II.
Dewey was a popular first New York State Attorney General and Governor of New York. He was very effective at fighting against organized crime, and a fairly liberal Republican. He had a couple of disadvantages. He decided that he didn't want to get too specific on what he would do differently. That was a problem. By the way, the conservative Republicans were getting increasingly upset because the Republican candidates didn't want to draw sharp distinctions. They didn't want to denounce the New Deal and say this is socialism, and so conservatives were feeling alienated within their own party. A lot of conservative Republicans just saw Dewey as a repeat of Willkie. What sent Dewey down to defeat, really, though, was the fact that in 1944 the United States was in the middle of World War II, and election after election has shown that the American people don't like to switch horses in midstream. Right? If there's a war, they don't like to vote out the president.
Even though he passed away prematurely in 1945, waters of Roosevelt's historic four-term presidency navigated the country through the Great Depression and a world war. He inspired hope in the American people that better times were coming.